So how do you actually improve these workflows over time? And when I say this, I mean practically. Like, how do you actually cut through the noise and then do this thing in a way that is consistent and reliable? Well, you just ask. I actually literally just say, can you make this faster? Can you make this cheaper? Over and over and over and over again, like 30 times. I say, list 10 approaches to make this thing cheaper. List 20 approaches to make this thing faster. Most of the approaches will not work, but I will use my human judgment. And then after it opens up and gives me 20 possible opportunities, I then just pick one that I think makes the most sense. And then we proceed with that. And then I just repeat the process over and over and over again until my workflow is now significantly faster and significantly more optimized. That said, because I think a lot of people have probably stumbled on this, I do have a rule. And my rule is the order of magnitude rule. I don't actually do this anymore unless I can get at least a 10 times improvement in a key metric. For instance, time, cost, or accuracy. Because a workflow running in 3 minutes versus 2 minutes, well, technically it's a 33% improvement or whatever. It's not actually meaningfully better for me. And the amount of time that I take to implement it, multiplied by the introduced error risk by doing what is typically an approach that trades off time, money, or accuracy for speed against each other, means that I'm usually losing. If you think about it, it's basically, what's the metric we want? We want like time, right? And so the degree to which the time gets better is sort of related to the degree to which maybe the cost and the accuracy go down. And so the amount of time that I spend on this, in addition to like the introduced error rate and stuff like this, means that this only really makes sense to do if there's a very clear path to making your flow 10 times better. What's an example of this? I used to scrape tons of leads using a serial approach, and I found that it took forever. My serial approach was something like, 20 minutes for 2K leads. If you do the math on that, that's like, 100 leads a minute or so. I came through and I tried optimizing the hell out of the serial approach with like every way, shape, and form that I could. I tried like changing the compute that I was using. I tried changing like the Appify actors I was using. I tried changing like the API requests that I was making to Google Sheets and stuff like that. And I was only really able to get this down in maybe 15 minutes. That is like a 25% improvement in time, of course. But a lot of the time, this isn't even my bottleneck. Like, it doesn't actually matter if it takes 15 minutes or 20 minutes because I'm not utilizing those leads 100%. Anyway, what I ended up finding an approach that batch parallelized them. So sent, instead of 2K leads for 20 minutes, it basically sent 100 leads at a time, 20 times. And then it finished in approximately 1 minute. This, for example, is a 20 times improvement. This is something that I'd actually do. That actually worked. But this whole a detour or rabbit hole thing was just a total waste of my time because this turned the flow into an unreliable mess. So my rule is I basically just I don't make small optimizations anymore because they reduce accuracy and reliability for marginal gains. I would only do this on something that I actually see there being an order of magnitude possible improvement. What are some examples? It's like moving from software encoding to hardware encoding. You don't need to know what that means. Just make sure that when you ask the model and you see words like that, it's like, okay, I should probably use the hardware encoding. Parallelizing, or using what's called like multiple threads, or using multiple service workers simultaneously. These are things that usually do provide like an order of magnitude jump. Sometimes you can like fundamentally change the order of operations in a workflow. But in general, unless the model expects that this is going to provide at least a 10x boost, I don't really recommend doing it. What is really cool is that every workflow that you build does become a permanent asset in your library. And I mean this both in the way of directives and execution scripts as well. Your library ends up infinitely reusable. If you think about it, you could open up any workspace in any IDE or agent model. You could also copy directives and execution scripts over to anybody else's workspace, like your friends or your colleagues. You could put it on GitHub with like GitHub code spaces, something I'm going to talk about soon. You could reuse automations the exact same way that you do them in, drag and drop no code tools like N8N, Make.com, or Gumloop. But you just do that with natural language instead. Your blueprints, if it makes sense now, is just like a bunch of words on a page, which are much, much more portable. And over time, your IDE will become basically a giant treasure chest that you can deploy anytime you want, anywhere you want. So for instance, what my library can do right now is it can do automated lead scraping, automated email enrichment, automated personal replies on campaigns that I run because we're predominantly like a cold email agency. I can initiate high quality voice agent calls. I literally just say, hey, call this person. Hey, I want you to call people on this list. Hey, I want you to split to like 20 threads and then call 20 people. I could do automated proposal generation. I could do slide deck creation that actually matches my tone of voice and it looks pretty good. And all of it is customized to how I communicate. It is not generic AI slop. So it's pretty cool. Obviously, I didn't build all this stuff overnight. It took me a fair amount of time, a few days, a few weeks now to really put the finishing touches on all these. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this thing can basically be your terminal for life. A real example from my actual day-to-day was automating my school posts. So I kept forgetting to post a weekly community call thread. I did it 3 weeks in a row, which is really embarrassing, especially because I like to make it clear that if I don't do like the foundational fundamental things that I promise people I will do, then why the hell am I entitled to their money? So I gave a bunch of people refunds. I asked my agent, Claude Opus 4.5 at the time, if automating this was straightforward. I'd never even really thought of this before, but I was basically just like, hey, I keep forgetting about this thing. Man, I really suck. Any ideas? And then it's just like, oh yeah, we could totally automate that. So it went and found a pre-existing school system that I'd built, which just handled like the authentication and the logging in. Then it built a simple scraping spec and it figured it out in like 3 minutes flat. And I automated my school posts in 3 minutes flat using a simple schedule timer, which I'll talk about later. So now it just happens for me, which is incredible. And it's super easy and it's super straightforward. You can solve so many tiny little problems in your life using tools like this. So once you've built like individual workflows that work really well, then you eventually transition to what I call meta directives. So at the end of this, what you will essentially have is giant families of workflows that do various things. For instance, I will have like a marketing workflow umbrella. And this is a family of workflows that does things like, scrape leads, create ad copy, do voicemail drops. I don't know, whatever the heck, right? And so what this umbrella workflow, this meta directive does is it just ties them together. So for instance, if you have a bunch of separate workflows for, a welcome email, the setup of a workspace, and the copywriting of an email, this is sort of like an onboarding thing, right? So you could just tie all these together with a new client workflow that just does all of them in sequence. I recommend storing the directives separately in order to make this happen. I don't recommend just like having a giant new client workflow that's like 4 quadrillion lines because it's much easier and more maintainable for the model to load only what it needs in context at any one particular time. But this becomes really powerful because they just chain all of the existing capabilities together. Instead of you having to go like 1, 2, 3, you have like 4 or 5 workflows. What you do is you just turn that into one workflow. And then every time you want all of these done in sequence, you just call the big workflow, not individual workflows. It also means that when you prompt the model and use it as like an assistant or whatever, you could just say, hey, I want you to do X, Y, and Z onboarding workflow. And then you can just step away, have a freaking nice cup of tea or something like that, and come back and everything's okay. You don't actually have to get like interrupted all the time. And yeah, when you combine that with the infinite reusability of these workflows, this becomes really, really powerful because then you can just send your new client workflow to the other 3 account managers on your team, and then they can just run it every time they get a new client. Or as I'm going to show you later, maybe you could attach that to a schedule trigger or some sort of webhook so that it just runs autonomously without you. Hopefully that makes sense. Now we're starting one of my favorite topics in directive orchestration execution and just agentic workflows in general, and that's this idea of self-annealing. First, let's talk about annealing in a general sense. Annealing is the process of heating a piece of metal and then slowly cooling it down. Basically, what happens is previously the molecules in the metal are kind of all over the place. But what happens when you heat up a metal is they end up actually moving to like their highest or rather lowest energy state, and they end up looking kind of like a crystal lattice, which is really badass. And then what we do is we cool it down very quickly, which then hardens this and sets it into, some really strong, robust piece of metal. Blacksmiths and so on have been doing this for many, many generations. It removes a bunch of these internal weird misconfigurations of the atoms, and it creates a really strong, more stable structure. So people do this with swords and, devices and pieces of metals all the time in real life. It's cool as hell. And today I wanted to talk about a similar concept in agentic workflows. So what if we had the ability to stress test our workflows as well to make them significantly more resilient? Turns out we do. When we build instruction sets, prompts, or directives for our agents, I want you to think of them as looking something like what we see on the left-hand side here. In short, these are pretty rough. We have some idea of how we want the workflow to develop. Maybe we want it to start here, and then go over here, and go over here, here, and then here. But we don't really have a strong mechanism to do it. All we really have so far is just an outline. When you say step 1, do X, step 2, do Y, and step 3, do Z, all this really is just a couple of bullet points on a piece of paper. And even if you have an agent like produce a workflow for you in a directive form, it's not super tight. What self-annealing does is basically every single time we run into some error or issue or opportunity for improvement, the system reinforces that flow. And so if this on the left-hand side is what we kind of do on the first day, This on the right-hand side is after maybe 60 days of you using an agentic workflow. Instead of it just being this small little pissant line on the left, we have a super strong battle-hardened protocol. Every one of these little shields is some form of retry logic. It's so much beefier. There's like validation steps that go into place. Maybe you have human in the loop at specific steps that you didn't realize that you needed before, and so on and so forth. And so, if I'm somebody designing a workflow, despite the fact that I start over here on the left-hand side, at the end of this self-annealing process, my workflow actually becomes super, super robust and very resilient as well. So that concept is self-annealing. Instead of brittle systems that break every time that you error out, like with, N8N or Make or whatever, when you build these systems, they just strengthen over time. The secret ingredient is adding a level of thoughtful error handling to your system prompt. And the whole idea is when you do this, it will learn and it will adapt. Problems essentially stop being like problems in the error sense, and they start being opportunities for you and the model to build edge cases, error handling, and sort of unexpected steps in that you just didn't really understand the first time, because a lot of the time, the only way to know is just by doing a bunch. So when you enter this self-annealing loop, essentially what happens is there'll be some sort of error. Immediately after, you will diagnose where the error is coming from. Then you will attempt some sort of fix. After the fix, you will then update. So you'll actually update the workflow, the execution script itself, and they'll just rotate over and over and over and over and over again. And then finally, eventually, this stops erroring out, right? And then it becomes successful. And when it becomes successful, all we do is we just do some sort of documentation upgrade. And so we let the directive know, hey, this is a common issue that previously used to happen a lot. We've since reinforced against it, and it's a lot better. And then the next time the loop fixes. And let's say this eventually goes into some sort of error. Well, guess what happens? We just run the same thing. We go through an error, then we diagnose, then we fix, or attempt to fix, I should say, and then we update. And then we just loop over and over and over again until we can no longer loop, okay? So this is really like that 4-step process. The agent will continue until the operation succeeds or it hits like some super unfixable wall, just something that like actually requires a human being. Even when something is unfixable, you'll find that an agent often will find a creative workaround. So like, for instance, if one of the things that you asked for is like you asked for 50 leads or something, or maybe I always use leads because, I'm just super in that business, but let's just take a step back here and say you are looking for like 50 blog posts on a subject, right? And your whole job is you want to like take these blog posts and then use them to create something. Your definition of done is you get 50 blog posts from your scraper. Well, let's say the scraper only returns 40. This loop will start and continue, and maybe the reality is there just aren't any more blog posts on the internet about this. Well, your model finds a creative workaround by maybe changing one of the filters in how it pitched the first thing, and it lets you go from 40 to 50, technically accomplishing what you were looking for, despite the fact that it is a fundamentally different process. Now you're using maybe a different set of filters. And then although it didn't work 100%, it worked 80%, the model will then give you a notification or ping you or something and be like, hey, this mostly worked. Let me know if this filter is okay too. So then you provide some feedback or whatever, and then it actually cements the fact that this filter is okay too, preventing it from ever happening again. And in that way, every cycle will leave the system a lot more robust and reliable than it was before. So as a business owner, somebody that's been doing stuff like this for the better part of the last decade, I like thinking about agents and agentic workflows as basically mini employees. And in business, when you hire a bunch of people, you quickly realize that you can bin human beings into 2 camps. You could have employee A, who I'm going to consider the blocker, and then you can have employee B, who I'm going to consider pretty self-capable. So in the situation of employee A, anytime that they have a problem, and I've hired a lot of people like this, that problem is now your problem. So, hey, boss, I tried doing XYZ, couldn't make it happen. Could you help me with this? Meaning, this is the sort of person that cannot proceed without your intervention. Every time they run into an issue, well, now it's your issue as well. All work grinds to a halt, not just theirs. This is the sort of person that makes the same mistakes over and over and over again, doesn't seem to learn, and ultimately you become the bottleneck for their productivity. They almost require you to micromanage them in order to succeed. I'm sure there's some business owners here that are watching this video. This happens very often. And this is one of like the easiest and simple tells that you probably shouldn't hire a person that, runs into issues and can't actually self-mitigate them. Employee B, on the other hand, is a star performer. They encounter the same problems, but they have a simple SOP. The SOP is, well, even if I don't know how to solve the problem, I'm going to try on my own first. And so they'll only escalate when it's absolutely necessary. They respect your time. They document solutions when they run into them that your team so that your team never ever hits the same issue twice. They make a statement in your Slack, hey guys, ran into XYZ problem, just wanted you all to know that you could fix this by doing XYZ solution. Sometimes they even run a quick session to teach others what they learned. Now, if I gave you a choice between these two, which one would you choose? Obviously, you'd choose employee B, and I think most business owners would too. Well, self-annealing agentic workflows behave like employee B. They don't behave like employee A. And so we're giving them a level of autonomy that I think a lot of people previously would have considered insane. But I think the definition of insane is going to change pretty quickly as these models get more and more intelligent. How do you actually enable this cool process? It really just boils down to a small set of instructions and a prompt. You just add to your Claude MD, Gemini MD, Agents MD, whatever, a key thing that just changes its opinion, essentially like the default mode of problem solving. And the default mode of problem solving with these programming agents is usually, hey, if I can't do something, return it to the user and ask them what they'd like me to do, which makes sense because for the most part, these sorts of models are used predominantly in like enterprise coding applications now, where like a small change can actually result in a big downstream problem. But like if we're building simple agentic workflows that are modular and like unit testable, and then we're just using them in our IDE, like that doesn't apply to us. So all we say is something along the lines of, hey, when you encounter an error, first diagnose it, then fix it, then update your scripts and directives to handle similar errors in the future. Now, what I always add is something like try super duper hard before escalating to the user. What happens over time is the initial workflow will look very different on the initial implementation than it does, several weeks later. Retry logic in instances where one-off failures occur will be added automatically. It'll do things like self-retry loops. It'll do things like, if you guys are in the programming space, you'll know there's stuff like exponential backoff. There's various forms of error handling like logging and so on and so forth. And because it is hyper optimized to program really well and understands these things outside of the box, it'll just do them for you, which means edge cases that you never anticipated get handled as your agent encounters them. Efficiency improvements occur organically, bulk endpoints, parallelization, multiple workers. If there's like a request that you made initially in your directive, I want this to occur in under 5 minutes. After you run this every single time, just make sure to like see how long it took. If it takes more than 5 minutes, ideate solutions. If you have simple little blockers in there or decision or router points in there, agents will naturally do a lot of this stuff for you, which is really cool. And then obviously you can also just ask, hey, make this thing better, make this thing better, make this thing better, make this thing better. In this way, your system continuously optimizes itself without any form of ongoing intervention, which is the coolest thing ever in practice. That said, when you guys start getting really deep into self-annealing and you have workflows that do a lot of their work themselves, safety becomes a much bigger portion of the conversation than it ever was before. Like with N8N and Make.com workflows, the biggest potential issue was basically that you just like turned it on and you forgot to turn it off. And then it just continued consuming your credits or operations or whatever longer than you realistically wanted it to, which charges costs and so on and so forth. But most APIs, most systems, and most automation platforms now have some sort of built-in detection for this, or at least thresholds that you could set. So it's not that big of a deal. But with fully autonomous AI, especially AI that we're proposing giving total bypassed permission access to a system, safety becomes much more important. I was just reading this thread the other day where somebody let Gemini basically run autonomously for, I think it was like 2 days or something like that. And, it checked in and it had some cool little workflow loop where it did this. But then when they went back to it, they realized that they didn't put it in a container. They basically give it full system access and then it like deleted their whole like C or D drive. Anybody that's in the know, if you delete your whole C or D drive, your computer's basically screwed. You have to do like a fresh install. So that's on your server, right? The thing is, you're also giving this thing access to the internet. And so if you have cookies or API keys or whatever, I'm sure you can imagine, even if there's like a 0.1% risk, if you just stack up that 0.1% over the course of a very long period of time, okay, this is just, let's say, 99.9 raised to the 1,000 operations. At the end of this process, there is only a 36% chance that the model will actually do what you initially intended it to do, despite the fact that on an individual basis, every step was 99.9% secure and logical. The more steps you have, basically the larger those error bars become, like I've drawn a few times now. So what this means is we really do have to add at least some sort of guardrail towards the model so that it doesn't screw things around completely. Now, there are a few simple ones that I do. My processes are never 1,000 steps, right? I mean, I might be dealing with a 5 or 10 step process. process. So I typically don't have to go much further than this, but if you want really autonomous, long-running agents, you need to develop what are called harnesses for them, which I cover later. But basically, here are 4 things that I would always do. I would always ask the model to confirm beyond making API calls above a cost threshold. So a lot of APIs have the ability to check usage. So I'd actually add like a little step in there that says, hey, make sure to check the usage. If you've spent more than, $5 in the last like few minutes, then you should not continue doing this. You should let me know, send me a notification, whatever. Hey, never modify credentials or API keys unless I explicitly tell you to. That's valuable because a lot of the time it'll do things like reformat your API keys. Sometimes it'll delete API keys that it thinks it doesn't need anymore. Sometimes, that'll be a big pain in your ass because you have to go back to the platform, then reinstitute an API key. Never move secrets out of env files or hard code them into the code base. Models are really good at this already, but I always just like having this explicit because if I try and share something with somebody at any point in time and it has like my Anthropic API key or whatever, then these guys now own my ass. And finally, although this does eventually run into a limit, I have the model log all self-modifications as a change log at the bottom of the directive. What this does is it basically allows me to take a look at any point in time and be like, okay, so like what was the sequence of events? What was the order of operations essentially? I do this in like GitHub format, so it's sort of like a commit if you guys know what that means. And it's a really simple, just like one paragraph, a lot of the time it's just like a 1-sentence explanation of the changes that we made, how the changes worked and whatever. And the reason why this is valuable is because like if you're not using version control, like a lot of people will not be using, and I know that for a fact, at least you have like a change log that the model can use to go through and see, before this I was doing X and that was working okay. Then I tried doing Y and Y is working not so good. So let's move back to X. You should also just accept that some rules will occasionally be broken. That's just how these things are. We know that agents are probabilistic at this point. 100% compliance and everything is just not realistic and it's not achievable. So despite our best efforts, there will always be some sort of edge case failure, although it is getting a lot better with time, obviously. This is just a trade-off that we have to accept anytime we're using AI. I mean, AI multiplies our leverage by thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times, right? But in doing so, it also multiplies accuracy or reliability issues as well. Again, it's one of those like, even if our human workflows are 99.9% accurate, obviously if you run them enough times, let's say 1,000 times, these errors compound and then you end up with a total process that's only maybe 36% successful. Well, a human being can typically spot that earlier, but also a human being typically just doesn't do 1,000 operations in a row, right? There'll usually be some sort of check mark or guardrail. With agents, you could do 1,000 operations like this. So obviously, despite the fact that like our accuracy levels are still really high, because we're giving them so much autonomy, and because at the end of the day, they do lack some context that human beings have. And, a lot of people would argue they're not as intelligent as like the most intelligent human being. This thing is just going to occur, and there's just nothing you can do about it. So I plan for graceful recovery, not perfect prevention, and I'd recommend you do too. Cool, let's chat about using these workflows. And I just want to make this clear that this program is both about building workflows, and then it's also using said workflows. And the two are not the same. Building a workflow versus using a workflow are two very different things. When I build a workflow, I am having my agent essentially be a programmer for me. When I use my workflows, that's sort of DOE, right? The directive orchestration execution idea. My agent is just executing a sequence of steps that a previous iteration of an agent built. So these agentic workflows are mostly about the using side of things, right? Like building them, while is important and stuff like that, it's just a very small part of actually living in your IDE and getting things done. And to that point, I have an important thing to say. The interface to everything is now just a text box. So my actual day-to-day work occurs almost entirely now through a single text box. It occurs through, anti-gravity or Visual Studio Code. And I just have the agent do everything that I have created painstakingly over the course of the last few weeks using the tools that I've set up. So I'll have it do things like generate, my YouTube thumbnails. I'll have it do things like generate scripts and stuff like that I could send to people. I have it do things like generate pitch decks so that I could send to people that are interested in working with me, generate proposals. I do things like analyze my transcripts and stuff like that. But I don't do it in individual software applications, okay? I don't do it in Fireflies and Google Drive and PandaDoc and Stripe and, Quiller and all these other platforms. I literally just do it all through a single text interface. And this is just the way that high leverage work is now going to be done, at least until we come up with a better alternative, which may come in some time, but I wouldn't hold down on it. For a lot of people, a single text box feels like a downgrade. Because if you think about it, we've spent decades learning software through visual interfaces and menus. And GUIs, graphical user interfaces, are basically the current standard. If you contrast that to typing and stuff like that, a lot of people also consider it really slow and tough compared to, clicking buttons and whatnot that they're used to. right? Sometimes people type at 50, 60, 70 words per minute. I have some family members that can't type at more than 20 words per minute. Obviously, that is very slow relative to dragging stuff around and clicking buttons and stuff like that. So there is no obvious right way to do this. It's very open-ended and unfamiliar, and I'm sure eventually we'll converge on like a really cool visual thing that combines the best of both worlds. But there are ways to make doing a lot more natural and efficient, which I want to talk about. The first is just to switch to using voice transcription tools. In case you guys didn't know, you can now just say whatever you want to your computer, and there's like a 99.9% chance that it will understand that and be able to turn that into text. The reason why this is valuable is because the average typing speed is 50 to 70 words per minute, which is really slow bandwidth. The average speaking speed is 150 to 200 words a minute, which is 3 to 4 times faster. You guys have been listening to me talk at between 150 to 200 words a minute on average. Sometimes I'm a little bit slower, maybe around like 130. Other times I'm a little bit faster, maybe around 220 or so. But in general, I'm speaking maybe 3 times faster than most human beings type, which is very, very important. Nowadays, models are pretty smart, so you don't even need to really organize your thoughts in a hyper-specific way. Like back when I was using GPT-3, okay, back in the good old days, you had to be extraordinarily precise and concise with your prompts because even 10 additional tokens could really, really screw up the intelligence and the steerability of the model. Nowadays, though, I could have prompts that are 1,000-word text dumps where I'm in my car driving somewhere, I click the voice transcribe tool, and then I just talk, and it does a really good job at turning that into something useful. The highest bandwidth way of communicating with computers, at least right now, is the following. Nobody really talks about this, but you transcribe your text as input, which gets you to about 200 words a minute. So my input bandwidth is now 200 WPM. And then you don't like have it say stuff to you like you do with like, I don't know, the ChatGPT voice call or whatever. Instead, you just read as the output because most people can actually read between 300 to 500 words per minute if you skim, and most people will skim in some way, shape, or form. Some people can go much faster to like 1,000. And in that way, you have like 200 word per minute input, 1,000 word per minute output, in terms of skimming to relevant materials. The old way of doing this is like 50 to 70. And then if you're doing voice, it'll be, like 200. So what we're doing here is we're basically like quadrupling our input at both sides of this. This is like a 3 to 5x, and this is like a 5x at least. So maybe like a quadruple, I would say. I would recommend just doing that moving forward. It's way simpler. The only situation which I actually type stuff now is if I like absolutely have to, because there is some hyper-specific file that I need to reference on my computer somewhere. And even then I'll usually just like copy the name and paste it manually. From here on out, when I say the word prompt, assume I'm just generating all this with my voice. And then you guys have also seen me do this in multiple demos, but I will proceed to assume that you guys know that. How do you actually use workflows? Well, it's really simple. Hopefully you guys have already seen. We just ask for it. There's no need to memorize the exact name of the directive. Agent typically knows the directives exist because we've included that in our system prompt, and it'll scan for matches automatically. You do, of course, need to provide some data, specifically that your directive's input schema requires. So if your directive says, hey, I want you to include, the name of a person or something like this, and we need the name of the person in order to generate some form of proposal or something. And if you say, hey, just do the thing, it'll look at it and be like, hey, you're currently lacking this input. So like, what's the name of the person you wanted? Let me know and I'll create that for you. Really, this is just like ordering food, right? Kitchen needs to know what dish, any modifications or whatever. You can't just say, hey, get me food. You need to be like, hey, can I have like the hamburger with a side of fries, please? Like there's a level of specificity here. You don't have to go super deep, but you also don't need to overthink it. I'm pretty specific with my requests that I know have specific input methods. So like in the case of getting me some leads, I can absolutely just say, hey, get me some leads today. Obviously, it's going to ask me a bunch of questions, and then I'm going to have to like feed those questions in, and then I can kind of mess about with my directive, right? So I'd much rather say, hey, scrape 200 HVAC companies in Texas, then verify the emails, personalize them, and then give me the Google Sheet. This takes, 2 seconds longer than the first version, but because I'm at the helm of the ship, I'm able to steer it into a much more straight line direction to what it is that I want. The more steps you put in an AI's hands, the more chances for errors that it has. Remember that error rates multiply. If I had, a 90% chance of doing the first thing correctly and then a 90% chance of doing the second thing correctly, I would have a 0.81% total chance. Ideally, we're dealing with higher rates, but let me just show you how that transforms, right? If I give it everything I need immediately, I now have, this is a 90%. Let's say, in the first one, I say, get me leads. Well, what happens? It interprets my request as saying, okay, we need to get some leads. So let's go to the directive or whatever. And then it says, we don't have any leads. Hey, Nick, can you send me some leads? And then I need to provide it leads. And then it goes through another process and then gives me a total success rate of, let's say, 81% here. If I just say, hey, scrape me 200 HVAC companies in Texas, verify their emails and so on and so forth, it's only been one step. So I've significantly reduced what's called the compound probability of the error. When you're specific, you also reduce the back and forth. It lowers your overall failure risk, and then it's just faster. So I just do it faster that way. If you're not sure what's available, you could just ask like, hey, what workflows do I have? Eventually after you design so many directives, it does start being a little bit overwhelming for both you and the model. And obviously there are some strategies that you could use to help accommodate that, like sub-agents, which we talk about later. But for now, just know that, if you don't know what's available, absolutely just ask your model. You could ask the model to do things like refactor your directive base. Hey, are any directives that look really similar? Or any executions that look really similar? I want you to run a comprehensive refactor on everything to like group them in ways that make sense. You obviously have a lot of freedom to do this on your own. Now, for really complex workflows, I'll usually just paste in the context rather than typing it all manually. Like, rather than asking the model to do some sort of like Firefly's API request for me, I'll just like paste my call transcript directly in. It takes approximately the same amount of time. It's just this one is like exact and there's no room for error. Another really common request that I typically will do is I will like go to a website and I'll just like command alt, copy everything and then paste it in the model. I'll be like, hey, build me a proposal with this website or something. Obviously I could have it, hey, HTTP request this link, and then it goes through that. But I mean, it's the same thing, right? It takes me the same amount of time to do that versus this. So from the model's perspective, it doesn't matter. Everything gets inserted in context the same way. It can be a big time saver since HTTP calls and then API requests and then accessing databases and stuff like that can take some time to set up. So if you're using this as a user, right, you are executing your workflows using this orchestrator, you can absolutely just like co-create with it. You can go on websites yourself, copy paste stuff in. It's no big deal. The next thing I wanted to do is talk a little bit about how to peruse API documentation with agentic workflows. So as you guys remember, in a previous demo, I built a workflow that took LinkedIn Sales Navigator URLs, fed them into this service vein, did a couple of other things, and then ended up giving me a big list of leads in a Google Sheet. So how exactly do we do this sort of thing in like a reasonable way? Well, obviously we could just, tell the model, hey, I want you to build XYZ with Feign. But what you'll quickly realize is models will spend maybe 50% of their time just looking up API documentation and another 50% of the time like running into some sort of error. Like for instance, if I were to use this API documentation, so let me just go over here, then feed this into AI and say something like, tell me about this API documentation. The first thing it'll do is it'll take the link and then it'll try accessing it using some sort of web search tool. That's what it'll do here. The thing is, not all API docs are created equal. And so some API documentation pages don't actually include all of the information that we need in order to do what we need to do. Some of them don't return things the way that we need them to. So here it's saying the page is fairly lightweight on specifics, no detailed endpoint schemas, rate limits, or code examples. You need to log into their dashboard to add the full OpenAI API spec with the request and response schemas. But that's kind of weird because we have all the information right here, right? Well, that's the thing. Some of these API pages only load through JavaScript. So realistically, this isn't actually capable of accessing the API docs. If I said, hey, could you find the endpoints or something, it could eventually do so, but it probably wouldn't do so very well. So I say, what are the API endpoints here? It's going to look for more information. So it's going to look for some spec to get more detailed information about the page. It's going to run through the same thing that it just did a moment ago, probably to no success. And here you see it uses JavaScript to render the UI, which means the endpoints aren't actual HTML. So now it's just starting to look and sort of guess at what the JSON information is for the API. Sort of annoying, right? Doesn't actually provide that information. So what else is it going to do? Well, it's going to do more. It's going to start looking for other people's API docs. It'll start looking for blog posts and stuff like that. And I mean, like this information here, it's not terrible or anything, but if we're clear about how long this takes and then what sort of resources it's requiring on our end, if I just type \context over here, you can see now that we've already started filling up our message context, right? I mean, MCP is still the prevailing one because this is using the same series that we were using before. But yeah, I mean, like messages are already 1.4%. We haven't even done anything yet. Imagine if this continued operating on its own sort of like loop for another 30 seconds or so. Hell, we'd probably get up to like 3%, 4%, 5% or more. And so in order to prevent all of that from occurring, a lot of the time for APIs, I will actually just open the things that I want. So we wanted open, we wanted get, and then what else did I do? There was like a URL check right over here, and I'll just copy all of it in directly. So these are Vein's API docs, list endpoints for me. So now, instead of having the model do all of that searching itself, which if you think about it is like, that's an additional step, which compounds error probabilities. I just copy and pasted everything in, which means it's going to get everything right on the first try. It's not going to go back and forth or try and guess at various API endpoints or whatever. I basically have everything that I need. If I wanted to make a simple API call to the post endpoint, what would that look like in Python? Now it's actually going through and then giving me all the information that I need. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, great. Let's do it. Now, I should contrast that with a few other APIs out there that are actually optimized directly for AI and large language models and agentic workflows. So one in particular is the Appify API. And these guys, I want to say, are like a leader, but there are other services that are catching up and they're doing stuff like this as well. Like obviously, I could feed all of this into AI via plain text and, it would do a good job. Don't get me wrong. But what you'll see is that now there actually are copy for LLM buttons up at the top of the page. If I were to copy this for LLM, view it as Markdown, open in ChatGPT, open in Claude, open in Perplexity, it actually like includes information for AI models. And I mean, like, this is just a Markdown version of everything we saw on the page. Because it's Markdown, it's actually already significantly more efficient. And AI natively understands how to traverse this. So this is a brief example of like APIs accommodating to AI models and agentic workflows. APIs are sort of like anticipating that agentic workflows are going to quickly come and swallow up everything. So they're making all of their documentation totally available through like very token performant, token efficient Markdown like this. So, if I wanted to have it check the documentation, I would actually just copy this. And then I would just say, tell me about this API. It would actually go and it would first access the page itself to grab all the Markdown data. And what's cool is, despite the fact that it's a fair amount of text, this does so very quickly. Once it's done, it gives me a big overview. And then I can also ask follow-up questions. What kind of endpoints are most common? Okay, and as you can see, it's already providing me a bunch of information. So that's pretty sweet, right? You would not believe how much money on the internet is available for the taking if you just know how to connect to APIs. And nowadays, to be honest, you don't even really have to know how to connect to APIs. You just need to be able to communicate the fact that you want to connect to an API to a model. So if you could just say, hey, here's an API, could you like really quickly connect to it and then send a quick test query like XYZ, and then it does so, you can actually swoop up a large chunk of like the economically valuable work on freelancing platforms, simple one-off queries that, like businesses commonly require. Hey, I'm using X platform, but X platform doesn't have a one-click Zapier integration. How do we connect to their API? It's so scary and intimidating. I mean, like you can actually solve that really easily, not just for yourself, but for other people with a tool like this. In terms of how to actually do the stuff, once a workflow starts for the first few times, maybe first 10 or 15 times, I actually recommend watching it work end to end. It seems like this is a big time investment, keeping in mind that workflows can take, 30 seconds to a minute to execute. I don't think this is anywhere near that big of a deal, because if you just watch the reasoning for a little bit, for even like 1 or 2 executions, you typically learn more about what's the model is currently and actually doing under the hood than you would if you had like 3 days of autonomous flows. And so in doing so, you're very, very quickly able to iterate and make it very, very good. You don't have to like stretch that iteration process out for like weeks or months. What's cool too is when you watch workflows, you get to develop a sense of intuition about the reasoning the model goes through. And I honestly think there's probably nothing more important, no better skill to develop than intuition surrounding how models think as of the current date. I mean, these models are going to run our economy very soon, and they're already running our economy in many ways. So like if I am going to spend some time working, my whole time working should be spent developing an intuition for how these models actually function. I mean, it's also really satisfying. It's super cool just to see the model solve problems and, make logical conclusions based off information that I provided it. And it's usually pretty easy to pinpoint when the reasoning goes sideways. The model will be like, wait, maybe I should use this approach. And then you're looking at it, you're like, well, that's not the approach to use. Which means you can actually significantly cut the amount of time it would take by just like pressing X and then pausing the run and then just saying, hey, sorry, it's actually Y. Right? Way easier to do it that way. And then co-creating with that model also, again, lets you build that good intuition for how your workflow is supposed to work. Now, if I'm handling a really long workflow, like I have a video editing workflow whose full execution due to, the FFmpeg library can take like 45 minutes or something, I'm not going to just sit there and watch it, obviously, because most of it is the script executing and then my hardware running and stuff, right? So I'll just open an extra agent window and then I'll use what are called background tasks. Background tasks depend on the different model provider and interface that you're using. Claude introduced background tasks a while back, and I've been using the Claude family models quite a bit recently, so that's easy. What I'll then do is I'll set up some sort of hook in my IDE to play some sort of sound when the thing is done. Hooks connect to specific points in the workflow. What that means is like if my workflow takes 30 minutes and it's a background task, when it's done, I can actually have my computer go da-ding and then, tell me when the thing is completed. I'll show you guys an example of that later. There's also native system notifications, obviously. I just find the sounds more reliable for getting my attention. I get a lot of notifs nowadays. To set up hooks, depending on the platform, you just create a mini workflow that triggers the sounds or the animation. So you could just like give it a cool sound that you want, and then say, hey, set up this up so that when you finish operating, there's some hook and then it triggers this sound and it just plays natively on my computer, because that'll help me direct my attention back to you and then like help you with the next step. Claude has really good documentation on hooks. Most people that have built hooks have done so with Claude. You can check their hook docs for specifics. Their common use case, as I mentioned, is to play a sound when the workflow finishes, just so you could check the output, verify things are what you wanted. But you could also do things like play different sounds for human in the loop steps, where it's like, hey, action required type stuff. Okay, brief example of me setting up a hook. Here's a practical guide on setting up hooks. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'll say, hey, how's it going? I'd like you to set me up a hook that plays a nice chime sound every time that one of my agents is done with a task. That way I'll know to go back to the task, because I normally have you alt-tabbed while I'm doing other things. This already knows that it's a Claude code hook feature. There are shell commands that execute in response to events like tool calls. So now it's giving me all this information. First it's going to do some research. Then it's going to actually write a script to run the Claude code hook. All right, and it's now adding the hooks configuration with a little glass sound. I don't know if you guys heard that, but that's that. It just finished. So yeah, I did just finish. I'm going to pretend I'm alt-tabbed somewhere, not paying attention, but I'm not hearing the chime. So it looks like every time it plays it directly, I could hear it. Okay, so I'm going to \check hooks. I'm just going to start a new Claude Code instance like it's telling me to do. Hey, how's it going? Perfect, and now I hear the chime. So it's that easy. You could now set, let's say, 5 of these simultaneously. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I'll just open all these in separate tabs. Then I'm just going to send to all of them, write me a funny poem. Now I will send to all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nice. Now this thing has gone through and written me funny poems, and I got a bunch of chimes too. Hopefully you guys could see how this thing could be helpful if you guys were working on a Claude Code instance without notifications enabled or something like that, and then you were on another tab. In practice, I find when you are juggling a bunch of things and trying to stay in context, but obviously also monitoring or orchestrating some sort of AI flow, a big chunk of the time you will spend is literally just completely wasted time where you haven't given AI the next instruction. So to really economize that time, simplest way to do it is just to like have some sort of notifying flow. Play a nice chime noise, or I don't know, you could set it up so the Claude window actually pops up every time it's done. That way you'll very quickly go back to this, give it some additional instructions, and then be able to double up on the return on your time. Now, when any workflow completes, you're almost always going to get a deliverable. This is a link or a document or a summary or something. You'll also usually get some sort of report of what happened during the execution. My recommendation for you is to review the output, confirm that it meets your needs, and if it does, tell the model. Let them know. Say, this worked great. If you've had to do some trials and some iterations in order to get this, let the model know that like this is what you want and to update the directive in execution unless it's already done so. Most of the time this will happen automatically, but it's cheap and almost free to say that every time you get like a really, really good output. As I mentioned previously, individual workflows are really useful, but I actually think chaining them together is where the real magic happens. I always provide that umbrella analogy, and I like how my umbrellas are getting better and more sophisticated as this course goes on. I don't think I used to see that little thing up there. That's really badass. This is like your, marketing umbrella, your new client onboarding umbrella or whatever. What you do is you get all the individual workflows that you've created, group them under this thing, and then next time you can just run all of them simultaneously by just saying, hey, trigger the new onboarded client automation. This solves the manual handoff process with the deliverable. Like you could build a lead scraper, you could build an enrichment workflow, but what that means is this workflow will start and then it'll finish and say, hey, we're done. And then you actually have to take that link and say, okay, now do the enrichment workflow. Oh, okay, now we're done. You have to take that and be like, okay, let's actually send the emails. Okay, now we're done. Like, much better for me just to eliminate that process completely and then, only check in once we've actually completed the entire thing, right? Assuming that I've verified that every individual step does what it is that I want it to do. Because otherwise, yeah, you're basically the bottleneck. And I can't tell you how many times I've just had 10 Claude instances open or 10 Gemini instances open, and I just forget to proceed with one of the steps. It's like, would you like me to send the email? And then I'm like, where the heck's this damn email? And then I look back and I realize, oh, I didn't actually tell it to continue. I wasted like an hour. So I've covered similar examples, but here's another one. Lead scraping is really popular. So you find potential customers, then you enrich their emails, then you personalize their first line generation. I do this using a casualization workflow I've shown you guys multiple times. But essentially, this is all just batched under, like end to end new client workflow. So that when I get a new client, it actually goes through, analyzes the client niche, scrapes leads, enriches the emails, and then does personalized first lines before giving me a Google Sheet. It's kind of cool because this is all stuff that I was doing manually step by step. As you get to higher levels of abstraction, eventually we'll have things that are basically like, do all of the marketing for this campaign and it'll do a really good job. When does the agent actually require our help? Well, sometimes the agent genuinely cannot fix something automatically. And it's rare, but when this happens, it'll typically just ask you directly. Usually it'll provide a fair amount of context, which is good. Now, the question is what it was trying to do, what went wrong, and then what options exist to fix it. Your job is literally just to look at that and say, okay, let's do this then. Or, okay, update the directive to do this. Or, are you sure you've fully tried? Or, have you researched all of the solutions? Or something along those lines. And so in this way, you're not only like a decision maker at a high level, a lot of the time you're also just a motivator. To be honest, I can't tell you how many times I've had one of these agents go on some loop for 10 minutes and try and build something. And, they get really close, but then they just can't seem to get the API spec. And then I say, could you research the API spec? And they go, all right, yeah, I'll go research the API. And then they actually go do the thing and then get it right on the first try. It sounds weird, but a lot of the time agents don't just need the decisions made. They also need some level of motivation. I've also found that sometimes AI gets stuck in a really silly loop. Sometimes it'll literally just like do the same thing over and over and over again, and then it'll try the same next solution over and over and over again, and then it'll just chain those two together and go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Who knows why this happens? I'm sure the smarter the models get, the less this will occur. But when this happens, you just pause it. You look at the reasoning, you see what's going on, you say, hey, you've just been doing these two things for the last like 20 minutes. Could you please not do that anymore? Instead, do research on this best solution before proceeding. The reason why you do this is because iteration is actually just really cheap. So it's much better to do something than nothing. The cost of you sending this one message or whatever is like cents on the dollar, right? And then the potential upside is very, very big. And typically when you have like a massive disparity between the cost and then the upside, it would take many, many, many runs of this thing completely failing without returning some sort of like ROI. And in my case, I'm usually capable of doing it on the first or the second try. So when should you jump in? When should you let it run? AKA, when is there human in the loop? The way that I determine when I should build a human in the loop flow, or rather I should use human in the loop in a flow, is what is the magnitude of the outcome? And then what is the sensitivity to quality? So if the magnitude of the outcome is really big, AKA this single task matters a ton for my business, then I'm going to step in. If it's very sensitive to quality, as in if there are very small errors that create disproportionately large problems, I also step in. And if they're high on both, you absolutely want a human in the loop. A really simple example of this is cold email templates and then outreach sequences. So I do a lot of these, right? It's part of my day-to-day as part of left click. I find that when you have an AI do 100% of this, performance is pretty trash. And the reason why is because I could actually graph this. There's basically like a really uncanny valley, essentially, where, let me see. If this is the, let's just say, quality, and then this is the perception. If this is 0 and then this is 1, notice how it doesn't really matter how much quality we put in until we reach some like phase change level. And then all of a sudden it goes boom, and then it becomes really, really, really good. So for my cold email, if I have AI write, AI, it's gotten better over the years. Maybe it started over here, and now it's over here, and now it's over here, and now it's over here, 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 here. It doesn't really matter how good AI is at this process because the sensitivity of the perception of my email campaigns is very, very high. And so there's this uncanny valley effect over here where like a tiny little improvement in quality massively improves the perception. And so in situations like this where the model just can't seem to get up this thing, obviously it makes sense for me to like review it really quickly, change up 2 or 3 words, and then boom, all of a sudden the quality is up here, right? It's like, did I objectively change the quality a ton? No. But did the perception massively change? Yeah. And that might have taken me a few moments of work. So I find stuff like that is really, really important on, cold email templates, outreach. I would always, given the volume of the task, the fact that I'm sending this stuff out to tens of thousands of people, I would almost always at least have a person looking it over before it runs. Because it's like, well, what if I'm just like off by 1 degree here? I just wasted 10,000 emails. I might have as well like spent 2 seconds to fix that up and then sent to 10,000 and then gotten much better results, right? Same thing with financial documents like invoices and even proposals. I mean, I automate the hell out of my proposals, don't get me wrong, but I have a human in the loop step. I will take a look at the proposal before I send it out. Because imagine, what if you accidentally added an extra 0 or something? It's very, very unlikely, right? But even if that occurs like 0.001% of the time, you screw up on some number because your AI system just misinterpreted what you said, or maybe your voice transcription tool was wrong, or whatever. The point I'm making is like the time savings that you get by not looking it over are not at all equivalent with the negative impact to you, your reputation, and your business if you do not look it over. So anywhere where there's a few percentage points of quality making a massive difference to the impact, generally anytime the impact over here and then the quality over here has this sort of relationship, pardon me, I didn't draw that because I think my tablet's malfunctioning, you generally always want a human in the loop. On the other hand, there are a lot of tasks out there that are really low sensitivity. And when this happens, it's like the volume of this thing is a lot more important than being perfect. So you might as well just let it run completely autonomously. Good example of that is web scraping. Like this is not a really high sensitivity task. Models are pretty great at this. Creating multiple drafts or variations for later selection is a design pattern that I use all the time. And it's like, I don't actually need to steer it that much because the whole idea is I just want it to like generate me a bunch, right? So that's really simple. Generally, anything that scales linearly with quality, right? Where it's like the amount of quality here and then the amount of impact sort of at like a 1-to-1 relationship, I'm okay with it going autonomously because even if I'm up here, okay, and it's over here, the amount of time that I save having it automated, at like 70% of the full thing versus 100% of the full thing is typically way better than whatever the actual impact improvement is. Now, some things should not be automated at all. I don't actually think that you should have voice agents doing any sales calls for you. And this is something I see so many people do. Like, if you're offering a call, you clearly care a lot about the outcome of the call, right? It is a high touch sales conversation. And, if there's even a 0.1% chance that somebody thinks that it's not a real human being talking to them, it's like a robot, that's going to have a much bigger impact on the quality of that deal than 0.1%, right? So it's not a linear relationship between that at all. And, some things I just don't automate. Like, would I automate the calling of my client or something? No, I wouldn't, at least not right now at current levels of tech. Maybe if agent-based calling becomes better and like more socially acceptable later. But for now, no. What I would do is I would like automate the process of coming up with a bunch of information and context about the client. I would automate the process of doing research on the client. These are all things that scale pretty linearly, as I was talking about, right? So I'd have some big dossier of information in front of me to save me from having to manually go through hours and hours of LinkedIn research. But I would actually just make sure that the actual calling part is me, right? It just doesn't make sense. It's too sensitive of a process. Research, on the other hand, a lot more linear. There's some situations that do require empathy, judgment, but you can convert situations that require empathy and judgment into situations that you just like automatically say yes or no to. A good example of this is Amazon. Amazon has like basically automatic refund disbursement if you have asked for, I think, less than like a 2% refund rate or something like that. So if there's an issue with your order and like for the most part, you don't ask for refunds very often and you say, hey, there's some issue with this. Could you give me a refund? Like they will automatically be like, yes, refund granted. And then you're like, what the hell? I didn't even tell anybody about it. Like I didn't even give a photo or anything. It's fully automatic. It's like, yeah, see how much time and energy they save by doing that? So you can just reconstruct sensitive customer situations and like quantify them, and then you can like totally automate them. But in situations where like you genuinely can't, let's say this is somebody with sort of a shakier refund rate and stuff, like, yeah, you're going to need to find a way to pass that off to somebody that has empathy and judgment. So yeah, I mean, I would not automate things just for the sake of automating them. I'd only ever automate something if like it actually made a bottom line difference to my business. And things like lead scraping, for instance, research, accumulation of large data sets and stuff like all of this stuff does make a large difference to my bottom line. So I'm happy to automate it. But the calls and whatnot, it's all just me, baby. At the end of the day, your goal is supervised autonomy. It is not babysitting. So I just talk to them like Slack messages. I do not use formal syntax or precise technical language. I just DM my colleagues and then just replace the colleagues with my agent. I was running a YouTube workflow just the other day to edit one of my videos, and I said, hey, could you run the YouTube editor for the new file? Make the cuts a little bit tighter. And it took the average cut distance, and then it just like decreased it a little bit, and then it just reran the YouTube editor, and then I said I liked it, so then it updated the flow. So I would just use that the next time. Same thing with voice transcription in general. Just speak naturally and then send it. It'll understand you. Okay, so manually triggering these workflows is actually just the beginning. And that may be frustrating for you because there are many hours through the course, but it goes a lot deeper than this. Right now, what we're doing is we're opening our IDE. We're talking to our agents, and then we're starting the flows yourself, which is fine if you have like ad hoc tasks, one-off requests. It's fine when you work 8 hours a day and between 9 to 5 or whatever when you're at your desk, you can get things done. But as I'm sure you'd imagine, the automatic part in the word automation, like the auto, is pretty important, right? So how do you actually have these things run automatically without your involvement? Well, these are called event-driven workflows. For instance, let's say a new lead fills out your website form. You want a workflow that automatically replies and books a meeting, right? But what if the new lead comes in at 5:30 and you leave for home at 5? What if a customer sends a support email? Your agent does the triage, write the draft, and routes to the right person for sending. I mean, that's great and all, but like, what are you going to do? Like, wait until the next day, look at your inbox, and then do the triage then? That defeats the purpose. So how do we actually build these things? There's also schedule-driven workflows. Maybe it's 9 a.m. on Monday, and you want a weekly report to generate itself. So do you really want to come in every Monday and then be like, hey, generate my weekly report? I mean, of course you can, but it's nice if some of these things are done automatically for you. Maybe the weekly report summarizes your work and then sends it to your boss or something, or your client with your timetable, right? Same thing for these other things. These are specific schedules. Well, that's what we're going to learn about next. Webhooks and